Good evening and welcome to our book launch of Dr. Jan Kühnes Die zionistische Komödie im Drama Sammy Gronemanns über Ursprung und Eigenarten einer latenten Gattung. Zionist Comedy in Dramatic Works of Sammy Gronemann on the origins and unique features of a Latin genre. It is a huge pleasure for me to speak with you, Jan, and with our distinguished guests here tonight. Before we start, a few words on the technicalities of this evening. First of all, we will have around 60 minutes in which we have different contributions of about 10 minutes each. After that, Jan will have the chance to pick up some of the thoughts and respond to them. And thereafter, the audience will have the chance to ask the questions. Naturally, you, the audience, can already pose your questions during the event via the chat function of Facebook, and we will collect them for the Q&A session. All in all, we plan to have this event last around 90 minutes. So let's turn to the reason of why we are here today. Sammy Gronemann. This is him. And thank you, Jan, for providing us all with merchandise that comes with your book. And of course, about the book itself. Jan's book here. I think that everyone who knows Jan Kühne's work will agree that he has presented us all here with a crucial piece of scholarship. His book is a meticulous reading of Gronemann's works, the literature about him, but also numerous archival sources that are considered here for the first time and that give us a clearer picture of the persona behind his work. Jan Kühne endows us with the literary portrait of a man who is deeply committed to the Zionist idea and who shaped its early discourses with fine analysis colored by his very own form of humor. This humor offered him ways to closely observe and comment on the politics and the culture of both Europe and, after his immigration, Mandate Palestine and Israel. In reconsidering Gronemann's work and its role in Zionist politics and culture, Jan Kühne develops the idea of a genre that he calls Zionist comedy. And in conceptualizing it, provides us with a rich critical analysis of the history and theory of theater in German Jewish culture, its role in early Zionist politics, and the function of language in Jewish theater between Europe and Mandate Palestine and then Israel. Along the lines of the narratives of Purim and Pesach and their paradigms, which Jan understands as a performative coping with crisis, he explores Gronemann's works in their reflecting the nuances of the modern Jewish experience. The loss of Gronemann's name in translation in Israel might be characteristic of his times. But Jan's reading of Gronemann's works demonstrates just how much he was able to shape Israeli culture. With Jan's monograph and by initiating the critical edition of collected works by Sammy Gronemann and serving as the editor-in-chief, Jan Kühne has helped us to revive Gronemann's name and to bring it back into the Israeli literary discourse. Let us hear today from some of Jan's mentors and colleagues on how they situate his contribution in the different fields they represent here. And so it is a pleasure to invite our first speaker to this virtual stage, Professor Jakob Hessing. Professor Jakob Hessing is Professor Emeritus of German Literature and former head of the Department for German Language and Literature at the Hebrew University. And he speaks here today to us as Jan Kühne's former doctoral advisor. His research covers a large range of themes from Else Lasker-Schüler and Heinrich Heine over Sigmund Freud and most recently the Yiddish joke, which has just appeared this year under the title Der jiddische Witz, eine vergnügliche Geschichte. Some of you might also know him as the former editor of the Jüdischer Almanach between 1993 and 2000, and as a frequent contributor and critic in the German Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Zeit and Merkur, among others. Professor Hessing, I'm very glad that you are here with us today, and the virtual floor is yours. And you need to unmute.
You need to unmute.
Now, do you hear me now?
Yes.
But now I don't see you. Well, anyway, let me start with a short, two short preliminary remarks. First of all, I want to thank the Leo Baeck Institute for organizing an event like this, because in these difficult times, it is hard for us to continue the things that we are used to doing. And an event like this makes us feel a little bit more normal than usually. And I thank you for that. And the second thing I want to say is the pleasure with which I accompanied Jan Kühne as he was writing his doctoral thesis, which is the original form of the book that we are discussing tonight. The title that I have chosen for my introductory remarks is A Double Perspective. And the first of the two perspectives I want to use is a wider perspective of the German department in Jerusalem and what this means. You will understand that the establishment of a German department in Jerusalem was not an easy matter. And there was quite a long time when people at the university put up a resistance against the establishment of a department like this. Whoever wanted to study German literature had to go into comparative literature, and only late in the 1970s it was possible to study Germanistic proper. Now, when this department was established, there was, of course, a question: what does one do with German culture in Jerusalem? Can we understand ourselves as simply another branch of what is called Auslandsgermanistik? But that is impossible in Jerusalem because the Jews have been part and parcel of German literature for such a long time that it is not really Ausland when you come to talk about these things in Jerusalem. So what the central focus of our department has always been was, of course, German Jewish literature. And I remember myself when I was younger, how intent I was on proving that authors like Elsass Gestühle, like Heinrich Heine, like Kafka, were basically Jewish authors. And this is perhaps a consequence of something we might call the Jerusalem School of Jewish History. And the Jerusalem School of Jewish History perhaps is called the Jerusalem School of Jewish History because, according to that line, all roads in Jewish history lead to Jerusalem. And that's why a writer who stems from a Jewish background has to be read in Jewish terms. But as I grew older and a little more careful with my thesis, I started to feel that this is a rather difficult position to keep, because when a Jew wants to become a German writer, he has to turn into a German in the first place. And he has to immerse himself in German culture. And he will, on the way, in the translation, will lose a lot of his Jewishness. And I could, of course, show this in many ways. I will just choose one little point. Most of the well-known German Jewish writers and authors, when they had to go into exile under Hitler, did not choose the sort of Jewish solution to their fate. They did not go to Palestine, or as they call it, Eretz Israel. Most of them, when they had to choose a country of exile, went to places like Sweden to take Nelly Sachs and Peter Weiss, to England, as Canetti did, to America, as many other authors, Franz and so on, chose. And it's even more than that. There were people who spent the years of the war in Palestine, and after the war, they went back to Germany, or went back to other countries. One is Arnold Zweig, who spent the years of the war in Haifa, and after the war, he went back to East Germany. Another one was Edgar Hilsenrath, who saved himself from annihilation by Hitler by coming to Israel, by coming to Palestine, but after the war, he immediately went to America. Or Wolfgang Hildesheimer, who became a famous writer after he had spent the years of the war in Palestine, and went back to Germany to serve as a translator at the Nuremberg trials. So you have here quite a problem in defining famous Jewish authors as Jews. And now, in my double perspective, let's take the closer perspective on the subject that we are talking about, Sammy Gronemann. Now, Sammy Gronemann, I would like to introduce as a special case of German Jewish literature. And he is two things at the same time. He is an Orthodox Jew, and he is a Zionist of the first hour. And that makes him exceptional on two counts. As I said, German Jewish authors were basically immersed in German culture. They were the forerunners of what we today call acculturation. And they could not really remain within an Orthodox Jewish existence. So an Orthodox Jew who writes German texts is something rather out of the ordinary. And the second thing is that an Orthodox Jew at the turn of the century was actually not a Zionist. The fact is that German rabbis prevented Herzl from convening his first Congress, his first Zionist Congress in Munich, in Germany, and he had to go to Basel because German rabbis didn't want that. Now, Gronemann is a special case in two different fields. He is the odd man out in German Jewish literature, and he is the odd man out in the contemporary Jewish society of German Jews. And now we understand that Sammy Gronemann represents the two sides of German Jewish culture in a very complex way. He is a very complex German writer, and he has a very complex Jewish personality. And the very interesting thing is that the one person who has taken on this complexity in its full meaning is Jan Kühne. And this is not less than amazing, because Jan was born and raised in East Germany. Jan took up his Jewish studies first in Germany, in Heidelberg. And then he decided to come to Israel and in fact settle here. And he's been living here for years. And he is the first, this is the interesting thing, he is the first Gronemann scholar whose mother tongue is German, and who at the same time has a perfect command of Hebrew. And that makes it possible for him to do something that scholarship on Gronemann was never able to do, to put things together in a quite different way. And in order, well, we will now open the floor and other people will talk about this, but I want to focus on that particular thing that makes Gronemann more of a Jewish writer than Heinrich Heine, Kafka, Celan, whoever. And in order to understand that, we will have to make an essential distinction between what Christianity is and what Judaism is. Now, I want to say that the difference between these two religions are two competing narratives of salvation. Zwei konkurrierende Erlösungsgeschichten. And when you look at German Jewish writings, they mostly go along with the symbolism of the Christian narrative. Gronemann, as the Orthodox Jew that he was, relied on the traditional narratives of salvation that Judaism provides. And the interesting thing is this: what is the difference between Christian salvation and Jewish salvation? The Christian salvation says the Savior has already come, Jesus Christ. The Jews say, no, the Messiah has not yet come. This is common knowledge, this difference. But this difference has a consequence for Jewish thinking. Because we are not yet back in our promised land, because the Messiah hasn't brought us back, we have two narratives of salvation. We have one for the diaspora, and we have one for the end of times, eschatological salvation, when the Messiah will bring us back to the promised land. The one story or narrative of salvation that takes place in the diaspora is called Purim, because there the Jews were saved outside the promised land. The other narrative of salvation is that of Pesach. And how do we know that the salvation of is a messianic one of the future? The central sentence in the Haggadah says, "B'shana haba b'Yerushalayim," next year in Jerusalem, not this year. It is always tomorrow. And that's why, because the Messiah hasn't yet come, so it's Shana Haba. This is what I wanted to say. And I haven't mentioned the central word that everybody else will probably talk about, it's the humor. And I want to end with a very short and interesting example of his humor. I want to quote the most famous sentence he has written, the opening sentence of his novel Tohu Wabohu. Berl Weinstein hatte sich wieder einmal taufen lassen und diesmal mit besonderem Erfolg. Now this is a brilliant sentence because it puts together two narratives of salvation in a very, very humoristic way. Because a Christian says, once you are baptized, you have become a Christian. And this goes forever. This has changed your soul forever, but not Berl Weinstein. So he can do that again and again because he does it for money. He has to marry off daughters, and he has no money for the dowry. But he knows that Christians are eager to convert into Christianity, so he makes a business out of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hessing. And to everyone who joined us here tonight, we are with the Leo Baeck Institute on Facebook Live in order to celebrate Jan Kühne and his book, Die Zionistische Komödie im Drama Sammy Gronemanns. Actually, I also haven't mentioned or said my name yet. I'm Rebecca Grossman and a fellow at the Rosenzweig Center and a colleague of Jan's. So let us now turn to Dr. Brigitte Dahlinger. Dr. Dahlinger is a senior lecturer at the Department of Theater, Film and Media Studies at the University of Vienna, Austria, where she works on Jewish theater and drama, theater history, as well as the concepts of acting and performance. Dr. Dahlinger is involved in various projects, including theatrical activities in crisis situations and the lecture series Theater Under Pressure. She has also co-curated different exhibitions, for example, Roads to Leisure, Entertainment Between the Prater and the City, an exhibition that took place at the Vienna Jewish Museum in 2016. Her publications are manifold, exemplary. I will mention here her monographs, Verloschene Sterne, Geschichte des jüdischen Theaters in Wien, and Trauerspiele mit Gesang und Tanz zur Ästhetik und Dramaturgie jüdischer Theaterstücke. Her numerous contributions and volumes and journals include pieces on women in Yiddish theater, Jewish humor, and most recently also Viennese dance. As such, Dr. Dahlinger is thus another close colleague of Jan's, and it is my pleasure to have her here today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation, for the introduction, and also for the perfect preparation. And to Jan, congratulations to the book, of course, and also to the addition of plays, because I think it's very, very important to get these texts again, to make them zugänglich, to read it again, and so on. I want to talk about a little bit about comic elements in Gronemann comedies, its forms and functions in regard to the Zionist ideology. But I'm very much Spielerei. And I mean, the idea coming about these forms and functions of comic elements came to me because I'm doing a course at the moment at the university about comic and dictatorship. And the students and I were discussing forms of comics and functions of comics in regard to ideology and so on. And so I thought, okay, let's see some of Gronemann plays. What kind of humor can we find? What kind of comical elements? We can read in his works and also in the articles about him that Gronemann was a humorist. He believed more in the impact of comedy than of tragedy, in the impact of laughter. And as Jakob Hesing writes, quotes Gronemann, he believes that wit is a weapon, but humor is able to give relief and comforts you. I mean, there is a big difference between wit and humor to see. But if you give a closer look to the text, is it really humor without offending the listener, without offending the audience? I ask myself that. And I had a closer look to Hamann's Flucht and Jakob and Christian to answer questions like, which comic elements are used in these texts? How are they used? What functions have they got? Is there a connection between comic elements and the Zionist ideology? What about contemporary plays dealing with Zionism? Do these plays use comical elements too? Regarding to Hamann's Flucht, a Purimspiel in 5 pictures, written about 1900, published about 1926. There you can see popular forms of comics, as in a lot of German comedies, especially in the characters. The first thing is, how do they look? How is their appearance? And some of them are already comical in their first appearance, like Uncle Baruch with his sleepy hat and coat, or the French Mademoiselle. Also, the entrance situations given have got comical elements, especially regarding Heinz, who always gets in difficult positions. Also, Atlas and the rats and their appearances are funny. The language, of course. Concerning the language, Gronemann uses rhymes and songs, takes melodies from popular songs or children's songs, and gives them a new text, like hop, hop, hop. What is very funny are the different stylistic levels of language you can read in this play, like common speech between Heinz and Atlas, or rhymed speech in Persia or in Jerusalem. And there is also a lot of irony, especially through the end rhyme, when you read, gewiss, man muss ihn schleunigst kriegen, fehlt ja sonst in der McGill. Ja, also, yes, end rhyme. Or in Vespasian's army, who gets chocolate? Because in German, Schokolade reimt sich auf Parade. This is a very comical element. You can find also very similar comical elements in Jakob and Christian. It was written in 1937, takes place before World War I, and it is a very typical Verwechslungskomödie about mistaken identities, a very popular genre in theater and film, now and then. What can be mistaken or mixed up are gender identities or social identities. Characters in plays are getting mixed up with characters they don't know, like the other unknown twin, or lookalikes, or because of a misunderstanding. In practice, comical elements in Jakob and Christians are very similar to these in Hamann's Flucht. Again, regarding the characters. The looks, the appearance of characters are comical. For instance, the description of Kellner Fritz, who is proud of his tight-fitting jacket, stolz auf diese enge Kellnerjacke, ohne sich dessen bewusst zu sein, without being conscious of it. Some of the entrance situations are funny, like Dr. Wendel, who always is drunken or on the way to become it and drinks a lot of alcohol. Alcohol and drunkenness and singing of drinking songs are, of course, comical elements which are used in a lot of theater and films also. Language. Regarding the language, it's very interesting to see the wordplays, like lass mich nicht so lange mit gezücktem Segen herumlaufen, which is very nice mix-up with mit gezücktem Degen. But above all, we find wordplays which are based on anti-Semitic cliches and stereotypes. Like Dr. Wendel says, der ererbte Geschäftsgeist Israels, kaum hat sich ein kleiner germanischer Säugling etabliert, schon ist auch der jüdische Aussauger da und tut dicht daneben ein Konkurrenzunternehmen auf. Oder der Landrat, who says, wir wollen ja schließlich nur das Beste der Juden und das Beste ist ihr Geld. The main comic element in Jakob und Christian is, of course, the conversion of their identities, and the characters are playing with these conversions. It's also called komische Deplatzierung. If you laugh about a person who is out of place. So says Jakob about Christian. Jakob über Christian. Ein rumänischer Jude, ein Ostjude, tut so, als ob mir was schenken will. Jakob über sich selbst. Nu, ich habe Geduld. Geduld habe ich gelernt als Jude. Werde auch Geduld haben als Arier. Functions of these comical elements are first to get distance. Second, to make the audience, the reader, aware of the absurdity of the anti-Semitic cliches and stereotypes. Or one can say, in this play, komische Deplatzierungen proves the absurdity of anti-Semitism. At the end, nobody knows who is the Jew, who is the Gentile, and that's, of course, the major irony in this text. Is that also a narrative of salvation? I mean, this is my question, also in regard to Jakob Hessing's introduction in Gronemann's works. And the further question is to read, to listen to all these anti-Semitic cliches and stereotypes in the character's speech and or in the performances. Is this still a humor which doesn't attack? An interesting topic of this play is also Jewish anti-Semitism comes up as a topic. Yeah, okay. So this was some thoughts I had by reading the text, by seeing through the text again, also in connection with this function and forms of comical elements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think this is a very inspiring contribution, which I think has very well contextualized Gronemann in the theoretical thinking about humor and also the comic nuances language brings in here. So I think we can then move on, and I'm sure we come back to many of these points that you raised. We will move on to Professor Dr. Peter Marx, who holds Media and Theater Studies at the University of Cologne, where he is also the director of the Theaterwissenschaftliche Sammlung Cologne, one of the largest archives for theater and performance culture in Germany. His research focuses on theater historiography, Shakespeare in performance, the formation of theater as a cultural practice in the early modern period, the political theater, and German Jewish theater. His publications include Max Reinhardt, Vom bürgerlichen Theater zur metropolitanen Kultur, Hamlets Reise nach Deutschland, eine Kulturgeschichte, and most recently, Machtspiele, politisches Theater seit 1919. Another book that is forthcoming and it might be of interest to many of you sharing Jan's interests is the Handbook on Theater and Performance Historiography. Thank you very much for joining our conversation here today.
Thank you very much for this all too kind introduction and for the opportunity to congratulate Jan Kühne on this massive contribution to the research on Gronemann. I have to say, having read the book in the past days, it's intimidatingly erudite and well argued. So it's very impressive, and I think it sheds a very new light on Gronemann, who has been overlooked for so long. And I would like to focus in my remarks on three different points that I take from Kühne's argument and try to put them in a larger perspective. My first point is the motif of in-betweenness, something that Kühne sort of developed so programmatically for Gronemann. And it seems to be a leitmotif for Gronemann, not only in his biography, but also in his writing. The famous novel Tova Bo sort of already creates this idea of an in-betweenness and thereby focuses on the question of Jewish or German Jewish identity in the making, in a double gaze that also leads to, I think, one of the key features of Gronemann, and that is his quintessential irony. But also, as Kühne reminds us, Gronemann is put in the context of migration and also in the context of multilingualism and translation, something that is so widely discussed these days, but barely does take into consideration the question of especially the German-speaking literature in Israel, as Gronemann is a part of it. One of the most striking sentences I found in Kühne's dissertation is the statement that Gronemann lost his most popular play on the Hebrew-speaking stage to his translator. So I think this gives a different space of resonance to the question of translation and in-betweenness, to the question of being in the process of arrival. Also, as Jakob Hessing has pointed out, this key motif of the Purim script versus the Pesach script reflects on this question of in-betweenness. I think it is of particular irony that, according to Kühne, Gronemann lost his most popular play to his translator because Gronemann himself, or Gronemann made himself an advocate in the 1920s for the Yiddish-speaking Vilna troupe as well as for the Habima. In both cases, he voluntarily acted as a representative and brought these troops to a German and a German Jewish audience, trying to make a contribution to the discourse of German Jewish identity. Whereas he himself later didn't find such a representative, or sort of his representative, his translator, kind of overshadowed him. The second point is comedy as a form. As I have hinted, the irony in Tova Bo already is based on the idea of a double gaze. In Eastern Jewish identity, looking at German Jewish identities. And Kühne has pointed out how foundational this novel is to Gronemann's thinking and to Gronemann's work as well. The concept of the biblical comedy and the Zionist comedy, as Kühne has pointed out, actually is a unique and innovative point in case, and I think it contributes to Jakob Hessing's argument that Gronemann really sticks out of the group of German Jewish writers in the 20th century. The idea of two different key figures of thought, the Seder script versus the Purim script, here is very illuminating. But also Gronemann is part of a discourse of modernism, and is part of a discourse of modernism in relation to Zionism. And here, as Kühne points out, Gronemann's choice of the comedy actually is unique, in particular in comparison, for example, to Arnold Zweig and Richard Hoffmann, two authors with whom he was very familiar, who both tried to create a new kind of solemn form of theatrical pieces to portray the idea of a Zionist Jewish identity. In comparison to that, the choice of the comedy is really outstanding. The idea of the comedy might lead us to two further different thoughts. One is comedy as a uniquely modernist form. Kühne hints at the relation between Gronemann and Sternheim, but also we might consider Brecht's dramaturgical argument that only comedy is the appropriate theatrical form to respond to the experience of the modernized societies. So here the distinction between modernism and the modernized societies might be interesting, and I think it plays into the notion of comedy. Secondly, and this is a more hidden line in Jan Kühne's argument, there seems to be a line to the transgressive logic of comedy. So Jan Kühne refers to Gronemann commenting on a play by Margot Klausner, Joseph in Egypten, where one of the characters is called Pickelhering. As an early modernist, of course, this gets all my attention because the Pickelhering is the Harlequinesque character of the English comedians in the 17th century. And this sort of also relates to Kühne's reading of the Schlemihl-Figur in Der Narr und der Weise, whom he also describes as a trickster. So the question is there a deeper logic of subversion, of transgression that Gronemann sort of inscribes beneath the decorum of a proper comedy, sort of making use of the carnivalesque logic of overturning reality with humor and irony. A third point I will keep very briefly, and that is the question of theater and performance. As Rebecca was so kind to mention, I'm head of the Cologne Theater Archive. So one of my attempts in the past days was to track down any Gronemann performances on the German-speaking stage, which was a quick task because there is none. So Gronemann kind of is lost, or to put it in terms of my working title, is put for discovery for the German-speaking stage. And I think this also relates to the question of in-betweenness. The theater and performance might also be an interesting space for further consideration with respect to the reception of the Wilna troupe and the Habiman in the 1920s in Germany, who sort of played out very differently, and played out very differently also in the question of modernism as well as the discourse on German Jewish identity. So my postscriptum is very brief. I think Jan Kühne was not only written really an erudite book on Sammy Gronemann, but he really reminded us why it's important to think about Sammy Gronemann and why to go back to him. And I think it really is a very saddening fact that after two paperback editions of Tohu Wabo in the 2000s, his books are now out of sale, and only the unfortunately very expensive critical edition, which is scholarly, really gets all the merits, but in terms of popularity, it won't help Gronemann very much. But I think it's really worth also to look at this generation of German Jewish or Jewish authors writing in German that are disappearing from the public discourse. We are narrowing the choir of voices we are listening to, and as Kühne reminds us so masterfully, Gronemann really is an important voice we shouldn't miss. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Also for your very insightful remarks from the perspective of the specialist on theater and also the head of the theater archives. This is really insightful, and also on the aspect of liminality, of course, which is so prominent in Jan's work. Thereby, we are transitioning to a comment from the perspective of a historian, the historian Moshe Zimmerman. Professor Zimmerman is Professor Emeritus of German History at the Hebrew University, where he was also the director of the Richard Koebner Minerva Center for German History between 1986 and 2012. He is the author of countless publications in various languages on nationalism, anti-Semitism, the history of sport, film history, and German Jewish history, as well as the history of the Holocaust and memory culture in both Israel and Germany. I will be able to mention only very few of his publications here, but I do want to single out the following: Deutsche gegen Deutsche, das Schicksal der Juden 1938 bis 1945, Vom Rhein in Jordan, die deutschen Quellen Israels, and moreover the co-edited volume Zweimal Heimat, die Jekes zwischen Mitteleuropa und Nahost. And in engaging with these German sources and experiences, he too has encountered Gronemann in his work and can now offer his own perspective here on this encounter with this man and his texts. Thank you for being here. We don't hear you yet.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Greetings or congratulations to Jan Kühne for his excellent dissertation and his excellent book about Sammy Gronemann. I am not only the only historian here, I'm the only Israeli born among the discussants here. So, למה לא נעשה את השיחה הזאת בשפה העברית? סמי גרונמן הוא סופר עברי. Now, this is a real problem. Do we deal with Sammy Gronemann as a German author or as an Israeli author? In the introduction to the book, Jakob Hessing said it very clearly. War kein Deutscher. He was not a German. According to him, he was not a German. So if he was not a German, he must have been an Israeli. But it's very hard to consider him to be an Israeli and an Israeli author. Now, my personal memory goes back to Zichronot Shel Yeke, the memories of Yeke, which I read when I was only 14 years old. A son of a family which came from Germany to Israel, a family like the family of Sammy Gronemann, a family of the Neue Orthodoxy from Germany, of course, had this book at home, the book that appeared in Israel in the Hebrew language in the year 46. Now, about 12 years later, I was, let's say, asked by my father to read the book, and I found it uninteresting, and I didn't see any advantage in German humor. And this reminded me of another thing that I got from my father. He said, the German drama is usually a tragedy. There is one good exception, the Zerbrochener Krug, but everything else is tragic. But I can understand Sammy Gronemann also from this perspective, because as he said, behind the Jewish joke, there is always a tragedy. There is always a pogrom, which is the beginning of the Jewish comedy that follows. So this explains how I can, as an Israeli, relate to Sammy Gronemann, who came from Germany to Israel and never arrived in Israel or never arrived in the Israeli society. reading his dramas, his memoirs, one thing is very clear. He is always stuck with those themes that were interesting for the German Jews. You are interested in the relation between Christians and Jews in Germany. You are interested in the relations between Ostjuden and German Jews. And beyond it, you might be even interested in the relation between Jews from the Islamic world and the other Jews, the European Jews, because there you look for the so-called authentic Jew. He didn't invent it in his Malkat Shva, Queen of Seba. This is a topic which is already present in Jewish literature in Germany in the first half of the 19th century. These are the topics with which he had to deal. These were topics which are quite irrelevant for the Israeli reader and for the Jewish reader in the Israeli society before and after the foundation of the state of Israel. So he remains, after all, a German, in spite of everything. Now, my remarks should be considered as questions directed at both at Jan Kühne, from whom I expect an answer later, or to Jacob Hessing. The question that I asked myself when I reread some of the works of Sammy Gronemann, and especially in relations to his big successes in the Israeli theater, Shlomo HaMelech v'Shalmai HaSandlar and Malkat Shva. Why didn't he succeed as a Israeli author in Israel? So I think the secret lies already in what colleague Marx already mentioned, the problem of translation. He never arrived in the Hebrew language. Now I compare him to the one who was successful, and this is Ephraim Kishon. One of the remarks that was already used also by Jan Kühne was that Geis mentioned Gronemann as a predecessor or precursor of Ephraim Kishon. Ephraim Kishon is also a humorist. He wrote comedies for the Israeli public. The difference is that Gronemann wrote it in German and was translated into Hebrew. And during this process of translation, Gronemann was lost, especially for the public. Who knows who is behind Shlomo HaMelech and Shalmai HaSandlar? We related more to Nathan Alterman from the start than to Sammy Gronemann. What Kishon was successful in was the insight that in order to arrive in Israel, in order to be influential in Israeli society, you have to learn the language, and you can't use a transmitter, a translator between you and your Israeli public. This is one very important explanation for the success, or for the huge success of Ephraim Kishon in Israel, and the lesser success of Gronemann in the same public. Even if his two pieces that I already mentioned were successful, his name was practically erased from the perception of the Israeli audience. They both wrote about similar topics. For instance, the question of the relation between the different subgroups in Israel, the European and the non-European. You can compare the idea behind the Queen of Seba and the idea behind the comedy Shachor al Gabe Laban, Black on White, written by Ephraim Kishon. The effect is a very different one. The effect of Kishon is a very direct one, and he is the one who knows how to address such a problem, which is a very central problem for the Israeli society. Also, the question of the relation between Israel and the diaspora, or between the existence in exile and in Israel. There is, of course, a big difference between the way that Kishon approaches it and Gronemann did it. The difference which makes an advantage for Ephraim Kishon. And introducing what Kishon wrote to the German public, then of course he had the translator, Thorberg, who was able to make it schmackhaft for the German public, which is totally different from the situation in which Gronemann was in Israel. Gronemann was not made schmackhaft for the Israeli public, at least not as Sammy Gronemann. The question that is always prominent for a historian is, of course, isn't the answer to the question why Gronemann did not arrive in Israeli society, not explain, or the answer to this question, doesn't it not include also a political element? Ephraim Kishon, a satiriker, the one who has a very sharp eye for the Israeli society, was at the end somebody who adapted himself to the nationalist atmosphere in Israel. He is a representative of those who are ruling Israel at least since the year 77, and who were also dominant previous to before 77. Sammy Gronemann is a very different type. Sammy Gronemann, and this is a direct question to Jan Kühne, when he wrote in his posthum published work, Meine Entlastung, when he published the following lines, and I'll read them. After the fall, he wrote it after the Second World War, of course. After the fall of Hitler, his fanatic fascist ideas established roots everywhere in the world, even in the land of the Jews. To repeat, after the fall of Hitler, his fanatic fascist ideas established roots even in the land of the Jews. And he refers to intolerance and chauvinism and other aspects. The question is, it is quite clear. He would have been condemned in nowadays Germany as an anti-Semite, as somebody who shouldn't appear on the stage in Germany. We know the discussion going on at the moment in Germany about who is an anti-Semite and who is the Israeli who has the right to speak out in Germany. He would have been also defined as an anti-Semite who shouldn't not only appear on stage in Germany, but also appear on stage in Israel. Maybe this is a difference, the basic difference between Ephraim Kishon and Sammy Gronemann. I am, of course, on the side of Sammy Gronemann, and I just am looking forward for explanation of Jan Kühne about the circumstances in which this kind of a perception was written or put down in writing by Sammy Gronemann. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Zimmermann, and for giving us a perspective also on your own experience of reading Gronemann, but and then also in connecting it with the larger context and even Germany today and the discussions that are going on there. And from Israel to Germany, we travel now to the United States. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Sander Gilman, who is joining us from the United States here today. Professor Gilman is a distinguished professor of liberal arts and of psychiatry at Emory University. His scholarly interests, therefore, cover a very wide range of fields. I will be able to mention only a very few of his fascinating works, but I do want to single out here his work on Jewish self-hatred, anti-Semitism, and the hidden language of the Jews. Then The Jew's Body, another monograph, Freud, Race and Gender, and Multiculturalism and the Jews. He also wrote a biography of Jurek Becker and really many other works. Has most recently published Stand Up Straight, A History of Posture, and he co-edited the Oxford Handbook of Music and the Body. Professor Gilman, we're very pleased that you are joining us here today.
Thank you, and thank you all for an extraordinary set of presentations. Jan, thank you for an absolutely first-rate piece of work. I did, of course, what we all do as scholars. I checked how many times you quoted me. Sufficiently, thank you. Moshe, of course, would never do that, right? He would never do that. And Jakob, I know, did it first of all in the dissertation. I'm going to start with a quote from Freud, from the Witzbuch. Freud tells a joke. He tells lots of jokes. They're all terrible. This is an English joke. A very, very wealthy tobacco merchant is going to be ennobled and has to select, of course, a motto for his family. And he thinks a deal about this motto and comes up with the lovely Latin phrase, which if it were in British Latin would be read, quid rides, right? If you did it, of course, in school Latin, as I learned it, it would be quid rides. Now the pun in English is obvious, quid being a piece of tobacco, you've got an expensive carriage, who quid rides. Quid rides, of course, as Freud points out, means who laughs. And this seems to me the central question that Jan addresses. Who laughs? In his afterwards, he quotes Kessner, saying that there are very few comedies in Germany. I mean, people have made reference to this afternoon. I don't think I have to belabor the point. The German is seen as a literary language with very little humor. What is most important, however, is not that there are few comedies. There are lots of comedies. Ulrich Profitlich has written extensively on that. But there are very few funny plays. Who laughs? Seems to me to be a central question when one looks at Sammy Gronemann. And Sammy Gronemann, as has just been mentioned, not only in Germany, but also perhaps most importantly in Israel. Who laughs? Laughter is an index. No one has ever laughed at Minna von Barnhelm. I can guarantee you that. One of the problems that we have is that Zionism, as an ideology, as a modern ideology, is created by Neil Simon. No, Goethe Herzl, who was the sort of Neil Simon of Vienna. He was a man whose reputation rested initially, and I would even argue solely, on his writing of very light comedies. And by the way, if you read them, really awful comedies. I always quote Richard Beer Hoffmann, and Herzl wants to read one of his new plays to Bear Hoffmann. Bear Hoffmann says the only way he got me to listen to it is he rowed me out in the middle of the lake. Trapped as I was, I had to listen to it. Herzl writes, as we all know, one tragedy. And I would argue that that moment of the movement from the Boulevard Komödie of Vienna to das Neue Ghetto is, in a sense, the foundational rejection in Zionism. You mentioned Bear Hoffmann, of humor, but more importantly, of laughter. There is no person who is farther away from laughter than Max Nordau. The difficulty with Zionism is that as an ideological movement, it had to be taken seriously. And the irony is that was read as being serious, as being opposed to laughter. Now, we know, of course, and again, I will go back to what Moshe Zimmerman has just said. We know, of course, that this so-called dichotomy between Hebrew writing and German writing has its origins in the Enlightenment, in the Aufklärung, as opposed to the Haskalah. If Lessing is the Aufklärung, Wesley is the Haskalah, and Wesley's world is the world of satire. Wesley's is the world of the Hebrew answer to the solemnity of the comedies of Lessing. One of the things that's really important is to understand Gronemann not as a quote unquote representative of Zionist, he was humor and laughter, but of a late 19th century and early 20th century reformation of the question of being able to laugh in German. The late 19th century rediscovers laughter. And none of the initial protagonists are Jews. Karl Morgenstern, Karl Valentin. Right? These are the comic writers. Morgenstern of the elite, Valentin of the cabaret. The 20s, and I would argue this World War I transition of Zionism to a form of modernism, is the acceptance of laughter. Not the acceptance of only satire, not only acceptance only of comedy, but the ability to laugh. Laugh at others. By the way, I'm being as mean as you want. Laugh at oneself. Who laughs? And Gronemann for me is a very good index, because when Gronemann is transmuted, as by the way, few, I'm going to stress this, of the German language writers in Palestine, in the Mandate, at the time of the Palmach literature, and then of the writing into the 1960s, many of the German writers, and Jakob knows, and I knew many of these people personally, wrote for the desk drawer. Gronemann makes the transfer. And the question, and this is the question that was asked, which is, why is he successful in Hebrew? And the answer is because his plays allow Israeli, meaning Hebrew-speaking Israelis, who may, by the way, be Muslims, Christians, or Jews. We have this fantasy. The only people who speak Hebrew in Israel are the Jews. This is this, for me, extraordinary fantasy, which goes back to the notion that Jews have a kind of a secret language. Wake them up in the middle of the night. They'll speak Hebrew, right? Because Gronemann in Hebrew allows people to laugh at themselves, whoever they are, as well as the others on the stage. I'm grateful to Jan. I had not thought deeply about Gronemann since the 70s, a long time ago. At that point, he struck me as one of these interesting intermediate figures. And maybe he still really is, but he's an intermediate figure belonging to a world literature of laughter. And we know, because we're in the middle of a plague, that laughter is important, but it's of a lower form, right? Roman comedy was low. We know that the one book that we are missing, the one book all of us wants to find, is Aristotle on comedy. Because of course we have been poisoned in thinking that the only type of high art is tragedy. Quid rides? Who laughs? I think is an important question. And I think Jan Kühne has given us the ability to ask that question and maybe even partially given us a bit of an answer. I thank you all. I've had a wonderful experience listening to all of you, and I will turn it back to our moderator.
Thank you very much for this great and insightful comment. This is really an interesting question, and I think we can now happily turn to Jan and finally invite him also to the stage here. Before that, I want to invite the audience, which has been patiently listening here this evening, to ask their questions in the live chat of Facebook Live of the Leo Baeck Institute, where we will be collecting your questions. So now to Dr. Jan Kühne, who studied at the Heidelberg University and the Hebrew University, where he also did his PhD, which was then followed by a postdoctoral fellowship at the Martin Buber Society of Fellows. Currently, he's an associate researcher at the Rosenzweig Minerva Research Center and has also been a research fellow at the Israeli Institute for Advanced Studies. Jan's work does not only include a monograph, but also numerous articles, translations, and his own poetry. And of course, the critical edition of collected works by Sammy Gronemann, which he initiated and of which he is the editor-in-chief. The series so far includes Gronemanns gesammelte Dramen, Tohuwabohu and Havdalah und Zapfenstreich, Erinnerungen an die ostjüdische Etappe 1916 bis 1918. There are 4 more books that are still in preparation. Jan, I think I can say that everyone here is joining me in congratulating you on your huge achievement, and I now invite you to the stage to join the conversation on your book.
Thank you very much. This is very kind and more than I can bear. And in order to get this burden of me, because it's a very humiliating experience, I would like to acknowledge first all the people that have contributed to this event, and of course Professor Jakob Hessing, who has been such a great supervisor. And it's a real honor to be with you here as panelists, and Rebecca for moderating, and the Leo Baeck Institute, Yael Ben-Avi and Sharon Livney and Irene Auer-Ben-David for enabling this event together with Benjamin Pollack from the Rosenzweig Center. Having said that, I also want to acknowledge my Gronemann colleagues on whose shoulders I am standing, as it were. And that is, of course, in addition to Sander Gilman, who has introduced Gronemann into the scientific discourse in the 70s, as he has just mentioned. That is, of course, Dr. Hanni Mittelmann, who has contributed largely with a monograph on Gronemann, on his writings and life, and it's a book still worth reading, as well as Cesar Merchan Haman, who is currently working in London. And he has written his dissertation on Gronemann's life and work in the year 2000. And then, of course, without the tireless and meticulous editing work which Professor Dr. Joachim Schlör has invested in rediscovering and republishing Gronemann's key works, that is to say, Shalit, Tova Bohu, and having been the first to publish his Erinnerungen, Zichronot Shel Yeke, in the German original, in German, without these colleagues with whom I have the pleasure of still working together, this would not have been possible. I thank you all. And now we'll turn to the questions, and I'm certain I will miss a few points here and there, but I will try to address the key issues. And in my mind, they are centered around the question of humor, of modernism, and the question of critique in relation to Zionism. So beginning with Brigitte Dahlinger and Peter Marx, the theatrical aspect of his plays and the humorous elements, what is Gronemann actually criticizing? And Brigitte Dahlinger rightly asks, what is the religious aspect in a play which on the surface appears to us as a play, or his plays on the surface appear to us to stand in the tradition of classical bourgeois comedies, das bürgerliche Lustspiel, as it has been established by Lessing with the Minna van Barnhelm, where you have this beautiful scene where Minna van Barnhelm has to explain what is laughed at all and what it is good for. And from the beginning, the bourgeois comedy in German theater has a very didactic tone to it. So I would argue that Gronemann's comedies have a distinct meta-theatrical aspect to themselves, which is not surprising. We know that comedies live from exposing their own theatricality. But the subversive aspect which interests Professor Marx can be found precisely in this, because if we note that Gronemann takes the form of the bourgeois comedy and fills it with the salvific narratives of Judaism, that is to say, the narrative of redemption in the diaspora, as opposed to the narrative of redemption that leads to Zion, I think we can see how Gronemann puts these salvation histories into question. He never, as an observant Jew, abandons his Jewish ritual. And once he had been asked, well, Dr. Gronemann, you are shaving yourself and you are working with the theater, which is pretty uncommon for a German Orthodox Jew. So why don't you stop observing Shabbat, and why don't you stop observing Kashrut as well? You might as well leave it all behind and become a secular Jew. So Gronemann answers to this question, why don't you abandon Kashrut, by saying, listen, I'm not changing my diet every 2,000 years. And here we can see how Gronemann identifies in a collective fashion with the Jewish tradition, and this double perspective of an individual embedded in a collective narrative is one of the tensions we can observe. So it is just fitting that Gronemann would draw upon the genre of bourgeois comedy, which harks back to stock characters with their stereotypical characterizations. And I find that he is trying, in a modernist fashion, which I will explain in a second, he's trying to undermine these stereotypical characters by leading them ad absurdum. So the satirical piece from 1937, Jakob and Christian, has been mentioned, and it's a comedy of errors of a Jew, stereotypical Eastern European Jew, and a stereotypical Nazi, who are being confused until in the end we don't know anymore who is who. Now, I would argue that in the tradition of the genre, in the end, we usually know who is who. But in Gronemann's piece, this is led ad absurdum, and here I would argue that the Purim paradigm of ad de lo yeda is at play and has contributed to an innovation in the tradition of the bourgeois comedy. And herein, I think we can also find the subversive character, because I'm jumping to Malkat Shua, which was written it was staged in 1951. It was presumably written in the 2 years before that. Gronemann finds himself in Palestine, and he would have expected that when he immigrated in 1936, that the transition from the paradigm of diaspora would be exchanged with the paradigm of Zion, from the paradigm of Purim to the paradigm of Pesach. And in fact, the first draft that we have of a new drama that he wrote right after he came to Tel Aviv in 1936 is based on the Haggadat Pesach, on the four characters that the four persons, the four sons that ask the questions. But it remains a fragment, and pretty soon Gronemann returns to the old model of Purim, of the Purim paradigm, of taking his characters, which are always juxtaposed, similar to a constellation that is similar to the one between Faust and Mephistopheles, especially in Der Weise and der Narr, Shlomo HaMelech v'Shalmai HaSandlar. The figure of Shalmai is modeled around the figure of Ashmedai, the Talmudic king of the demons, with the wisest of all. And again, we can see how this is led ad absurdum. And one has to question himself at the end, what remains of redemption, and what kind of redemption? And here I'm jumped to another point, and that is the question of translation, which has been brought up a lot. At the time, since Bialik's publication of the Sefer HaIvri, the Hebrew book, it has become an accepted notion that translating into Hebrew amounts to an act of redemption. Any Jewish writer who did not write in the Hebrew language had to be translated back into Hebrew in order to redeem him and bringing to Zion, as it were. Now, German Jews that came to Palestine and that could not pick up the Hebrew language, as they were supposed to, and here I'm already entering the discourse with Professor Zimmermann, they were not redeemed Jews, as it were, and as long as they did not speak Hebrew, they would remain out of the flock. And here we touch upon a messianic undercurrent in Zionism, in the political idea of a state for Jews, which soon turns into the direction of tending towards a Jewish state. And here the problem of criticism comes into play, because the moment that Gronemann wrote his last essay, which Moshe Zimmermann mentioned, zu meiner Entlastung, to my exoneration, was probably the most tragic moment in Gronemann's life in regards to his aspiration to become a successful writer. There were many other tragedies in his life. Of course, that he had to leave, that he fled from Berlin in 1933 and spent 3 years in exile in Paris in 1936. Finally, upon arriving in the land that Gronemann had contributed to decisively in his function as the chief judge of the Zionist Congress Court, finally upon arriving in the land of his dreams, in an utopia which he had helped manufacturing, upon arriving 3 months later, his wife, Sonia Gronemann, she came from a Russian, Maskilic Jewish family, spoke around 7-8 languages, very intelligent woman, and she was one of the women that founded the Women's International Zionist Organization. Sonia Gronemann, she was hit by a bus that drove backwards, and then she died in the hospital. Gronemann henceforth lived among his sister's house, and he could not change his profession towards the British judicial system as a German lawyer, and he became ein Friedensrichter, an judge of arbitration. But nevertheless, he had more time now to write plays and his autobiography. But as it had been pointed out, he was dependent upon his translators, and that's the crucial point. He felt that as a German writer that could not translate himself, although we have some texts where he presumably translated himself and tried to redeem himself, as it were, he was dependent upon a largely a milieu and a cultural sphere which rejected German, since the language battle around the Technion. There was a cultural war, you could say, in Palestine, in the Yishuv, and German became a rival language to Hebrew. This situation, as Yifat Weiss has pointed out in one of her articles, had been sharpened with the rise of the Nazis. So German became doubly stigmatized as a language. And not only as a rival to Hebrew, but also as a language which inherently threatened the Jewish existence. So I come to my last point. When Gronemann writes his last essay and he talks about the fascist ideas of Hitler taking root everywhere in the world, even in the land of the Jews, Gronemann talks from the point of someone who left Germany in 1933, meaning the worst of what was coming he had not experienced, only through newspapers and through hearsay. So when he feels that he had been discriminated against in Palestine in the same as a German-speaking Jew, in the same way as he had been discriminated against in Germany as a Jew, he is talking from a very limited experience, which becomes very, very problematic after 1945, and especially after the Nuremberg trials, where the extent of the Shoah and the persecutions and the anti-Semitism in Germany was only revealed to an extent which Gronemann had not been aware at the time. I'm pretty sure that he would not have made this comparison 10 or 20 years later. At the time, he was talking out of his own experience, and this essay is very, very conclusive in regard to his humor, because it's the only text I know where he is not ironic anymore, where there's no humor, where he's humor only in the sense that his optimism becomes naked, stripped of any wit in its defense, and it's a very tragic text. So I think one has to make this distinction and read the Gronemann text in its own times, and this is really important to see it in its own logic. And in regard to the question of who is laughing about Gronemann, or I think it's even a deeper question, when we are laughing, what is the part of us which is laughing? I will leave it open for now, and we'll keep on thinking about it because it's a really interesting question. And as so many other points which I haven't related to right now, I've written them all down here, and this has been a really, really special event for me and thought-provoking. So I would like to thank you once again to all the participants and the organizers, and to my colleagues and friends, family and supporters. So thank you very much.
Jan, if you want, thank you very much, first of all, for your comment. If you want, there is one more question from the audience with which you could close your remarks, and that was one question about the play that sort of was distorted in translation as well. And the question was, when hearing and reading Gronemann in both German and Hebrew, was he aware of these distortions that happened in translation? Were there other audiences aware of these distortions? And also how did he react to the changes that were made in the translation? And maybe also how did he react at all to the fact that Altermann sort of claimed this, or was later on praised for having written this? Well, how did Gronemann react? And we have to close soon, so you would have to make it short.
Okay, so first of all, thank you once again for moderating in such a professional fashion. And thank you also for this question. On one foot, I would direct you to the volume of collected plays, collected drama by Gronemann. There in the appendix, you will find a number of these circumstances. For instance, in regard to his first play, Haman's Flucht, he points out in one of his writings that two Hebrew translations do exist, and one is worse than the other. At another point, he talks about him in regards to his translator Dov Sadan. He is aware of the fact that he is completely in the hands of his translators and that he's helpless. And in another place, we find that Gronemann wrote to his translator with a question. He wanted to change the title of his book from Erinnerungen eines Jecken, because at the time Jecke was still a derogative term, and his friends and relatives said, Gronemann, don't do it, you will bring yourself in trouble, this is not a nice name to be called. And then Gronemann writes to Dov Sadan. We have a collection of letters where Gronemann writes again and again, and in the end he only writes a letter with 3 big question marks, and from that I think we can deduce that Dov Sadan had ignored Gronemann's requests for revision of the title. Indeed, the book was published as Zichronot shel Jecke, Erinnerungen eines Jecken. And surprisingly, it had become a big success, and it contributed to a change of the derogatory term towards a more positive term. It's the beginning of a change in the perception of the German Jewish immigrants in Palestine and Israel. And 2 years later, Gronemann, though he publishes his Erinnerungen in the German-speaking Jewish newspaper of Palestine by the name Yediot Chadashot, and there we can see that the original title that the second title, the title that Gronemann had wanted to publish his autobiography with, is Erinnerungen eines Optimisten. And maybe this is a good way to close. Optimism was a really, really important concept for Gronemann. Hanni Mittelmann has succinctly defined it as the secularized version of messianism, being upbeat about the future. And for Gronemann, optimism was the core of his humor, whereas wit had to be in service of this optimism, of this positive outlook for the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jan. This was fascinating. Your book is fascinating, and I think everyone who hasn't read it yet will rush to the bookstores in order to join this conversation. I want to join you again in thanking everyone who was here this evening with us here. And I also want to thank the sponsors of this evening, your publisher, the Gruyter, and the Rosenzweig Minerva Research Center for German, Jewish Literature and Cultural History, and especially the host of this evening, of course, the Leo Baeck Institute, Jerusalem, with Irene Auer-Ben-David and Sharon Livne, and also especially Yael Ben-Avi, who has made this possible behind the scenes and has always been there to help us with the questions and the technicalities. And while we have talked quite a lot about Purim and Pesach, I think this is also a fitting topic now for Hanukkah. And on that note, I thank you all for listening. Have a nice rest of the evening and also a nice rest of this holiday. Thank you very much.